So good morning. Today we are going to begin our work on section 10.5. We're obviously skipping around in chapter 10, which is going to be on looking at a graph and writing a trig model for it. These are called sinusoidal functions. We could write a sine and a cos equation for all of these graphs. So basically we're going to go over the two equations for sine and cos and what all the letters A, B, H, and K stand for. Hopefully you've been using these successfully the last two assignments, page 623 and the worksheet. Those answers are posted in my CMH files homework answer key. So please check your work and send me any questions that you have via Teams. I'll work the problems out and put them back on my CMH files homework help. So today we're going to talk about how you could write a sinusoidal equation, a sine and cos equation. We have to know what all these letters stand for. If you remember, A is your amplitude. And B, the reason there's not an equal sign, the B affects the period. If you remember, for the sine and the cos, the period is 2 pi divided by B. Your H is in trig what we call a phase shift. In transformational graphing, that's simply a left-right shift, which is what we do with all functions. Remember, whatever you do to the x, you do the opposite. If you add h, you go left. Subtract h, you go right. And k is your up-down move. It's called a vertical shift in trig. And with all transformational graphing, that k moves you up and down. And whatever you do to the y, you do. So those are where all the letters are that we will be working with. So these are the steps. And again, just like it was important to follow the steps in graphing, it's really important to follow the steps in trying to write equations. This is the first thing you always do, is decide if there has been a vertical shift. So again, the first thing we're going to look for is decide whether there's a vertical shift. Sorry, my pen is not working the way it should. There it goes. So when I look at a graph, there's a vertical shift if the graph does not center on the x-axis. Like if I look at the first one, my x-axis is here. We can see that the graph is well above the x-axis. This one has a vertical shift. This one, here's your x-axis, it centers on the x-axis. You're the same distance above the x-axis as you are below the x-axis, so this one has no vertical shift. So you can tell that just by looking at the graph, whether there is one. Again, a lot of people just count. You're going to the middle between the highest and the lowest of the values on the y-axis. There is a formula. If you rather use a formula, you take the max y plus the min y, and you divide by 2. All you're doing is averaging the y values, and that will get you where your shift is. And this is really important. You want to draw a line at the vertical shift. So this is like your new x-axis. That's what you're going to be graphing on. If you've been doing the homework, that's what, once you had that d value, the K value, or the D, whatever letters we want to use. Some books use C and D here, and I might have used it. Some people use H and K. It's the same thing. But that's the value that moves you up and down, and you want to draw that vertical shift in. The amplitude then, if you remember, amplitude is height above the axis. And again, it's either above the x-axis if there is no vertical shift, or above the new axis that you drew in. So some people just count how far you went above the axis, how far you went below. There is a formula. If you want to use a formula, it's just max y minus min y divided by 2. Or you can simply just count, whatever you find easiest. So the first thing we did is decide if there was a vertical shift. And we could tell that because there is no vertical shift if you center on the x-axis. If you do not, then there is a vertical shift. You need to get that vertical shift formula, or get where it's at, draw out the line, and decide on their amplitude. Then you're going to decide which one you are going to write, a sine or a cos graph, and by that I mean which one you're going to write first. Because we're going to be writing a sine and cos graph for both of these. And the way I decide this, I always go where x equals 0. And when you go where x equals 0, if your graph touches the axis at x equals 0, you're going to do a sine graph. Because a sine equation looks like this. At x equals 0, it starts right on the axis. If at x equals 0, the graph is above or below the axis, then what you want to do is a cos graph. And why would that be? Well, a cos graph, if you've been doing your homework, looks like that. At x equals 0, it starts above or below. So I will have decided on whether there's a vertical shift. I will know my amplitude. I will have decided whether I'm going to do a sine or a cos graph first. And then we're going to determine the period. And again, all you're going to do to determine the period is sketch one cycle. And once you sketch one cycle, that horizontal length where you stop is the period. And then to get the b, you're going to fill into this formula. And that will have given you the first function. So this will, when you get to there, you'll have your first equation. To get the second equation, you're just going to use a phase shift. You're going to shift left or right to get the other function. If you started with the sine, you're going to write a cos. If you started with the cos, you're going to write a sine. So those are the steps. So let's kind of go through one together. So if I look at example 1, I can see that I center on the x-axis because I go 5 up and 5 down. So there is no vertical shift here. So there's no vertical shift. I don't move up or down. So the first thing then, I'm going to decide there is no vertical shift. So this is the axis I'm using. I'm going to get my amplitude. And I can see that my amplitude, which is my height, above the axis is 5. Or you can use the equation, which is max y minus min y divided by 2, which would be 10 divided by 2, which is 5. So you either count or use the formula, whichever you find easier. Then I'm going to decide whether I'm going to do a sine or a cos graph. So decide whether you can use a sine or a cos graph. Go where x equals 0. And if I go there, I can see I'm starting right on that axis. That's a sine graph. So I'm going to do a sine graph. The amp is 5. That's where amp number goes. Now I'm going to get the period. So to get the period again, I'm going to trace one cycle for the sine. So I'd start here, I'd go like this, I'd go like that, I'd stop right there. So where am I? Well, if you look at how the grid is set up for you, it's 1/8, 2/8, 3/8, this would be 4/8. So this stops at 4/8, so that means my period is 4/8 pi, or pi over 2. So how would I get my b? The formula for period is 2 pi, for sine and cos, 2 pi over b equals pi over 2. So 4 pi equals b pi, divide by pi, b equals 4. So I've got my b equals 4. And then I would simply put my angle. And that would be your sine equation. Now we're going to try to write a cos equation for the same graph. And you can shift left or right. I have a tendency to always shift right, but that's totally up to you. I'm going to shift right, however, because that's what I usually do. And everything's going to be, your B number will not change. Your amp number will not change. The only thing it could go is from positive to negative. You have to be careful about that. And you just have to remember where you put a horizontal shift or phase shift. And that's in the parentheses with the X. So a cos graph has to start at the highest or the lowest. So if I shift this way, this is a cos graph. So where did I shift to start that? Well, I shifted pi over 8 right to start that. So my a would be the same. We'll check if it's positive or negative in a minute. My cos would be my function. My b would stay 4. And I'm shifting pi over 8 right. So it's x minus pi over 8. And then the only thing you want to check is make sure that a stays positive. And it does, because the cos, if it starts up, it's positive. If it went down, it would be negative. It flipped upside down. So you're done. I have a sine and cos equation for both those. If I look at number 2, again, I look at this graph and I can see I'm 3 up and 3 down below the x-axis. So there is no vertical shift. So once I say there's no vertical shift, I usually get my amp, and my amp number is, I'm 3 above the axis, 3 below, so amp is 3, or use the formula 3 minus negative 3 divided by 2. Amp is 3. Then I decide if I'm going to write a sine or a cos. So go where x is 0, and if I look where the graph is, I started up. That's a cos graph, because sine starts on the axis, cos is above or below. So I'm going to write a cos graph. My amp is 3, and now I just have to get the period. So again, we're going to trace one cos graph. So it goes here, goes like this, goes like this. There's where one cycle ends. And if I look at this, how the axis is divided, if this is 1/2, this would be 1/4, and then 2/4, which is a half, 3/4, 4/4, or 1 pi. So my period is simply pi. So to get the b, you go 2 pi over b equals pi, and you cross multiply. 2 pi equals b pi, divide by pi, you get b equals 2. And there is my equation. Now I'm going to write a sine equation, and again, you're going to shift to get the sine. And I usually shift right, you could shift left. Sine starts on the axis, so I'm going to start it right there. And your sine graph would go like this. There's your sine graph. So what was your shift? Well, if this is 0 and that's 1/2 pi, this is 1/4 pi. So my amp was going to stay 3. My b stays 2. I shift pi over 4 right. So I'm going to go x minus pi over 4. And the only thing I always look at last is should the amp on the sine stay positive. And I look at this sine graph. It went down first, so that's an upside down sign. So we just change that to negative. So if I look at number 3, again, I'm 2 up, I'm 2 down, so there is no vertical shift. So then I would decide, I would get my amp first. My amp here is 2. And again, if you go max y minus min y divided by 2, you'd get 2. Then I decide if I'm going to write a sine or a cos. And I look where x equals 0, and I'm right on the axis. That's a sine graph with an amp of 2. And then I look at my graph, and I'm going to now get the b number, so I've got to get the period. So I go like this, go like that, go like that. And first of all, I hope you can all see this is an upside down sine graph, so I would just change my amp to negative. And then I would get my period. So how is this axis, the tick marks on the axis would be 1/2, 1, 1.5, 2. You just keep adding a half. 1/2, 2 halves, 3 halves, 4 halves, which would be 2. So your period is equal to 2. So 2 pi over b is equal to 2. So 2 pi equals 2b. Divide by 2, b equals pi. And then I'm going to shift for a cos graph. So if I shift for a cos graph, I'm shifting there. So we're going to keep this like this for now. I'm going to shift 1/2, so it'll be x minus 1/2. And this